I said in the last video that despite what we often hear, parables are not simple stories. At least not simple in the sense of getting the message, which is the point. But the story itself uses simple elements. This parable that we're going to look at of the sower, the soils, it uses dirt. I think we can all get the point that Jesus is making in the physical sense. Well, Jesus starts off, before he gives the parable, he tells us, and I just want to remind us, we have to listen to this parable. We have to hear it. And that's true of all God's Word. And what it means is I have to be open to it, and I have to be committed to living it out. And that's what Jesus talks about. This is a parable about listening. And so he gives the obstacles. Why don't we listen? Why don't we hear? Why doesn't the seed, the word, bear fruit? There's 3 different bad soils, and each represents one of these problems. Let's look at them. In verse 3, it talks about a lack of openness. There Jesus starts, he says, "Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow." And in verse 4, as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Now, remember I said the disciples don't understand the message, the meaning at first, and they ask him. Well, Jesus gives the explanation, and so in each case, I want to include that verse as well. Verse 14 says, "The sower sows the word," that's what the seed is. Verse 15, "And these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them." Now, we can picture that physical situation where there's a beaten path. The sower would just sow this seed and, try to keep it in the good soil, but there would be patches. There would be this, also along it would be this hardened path where people had walked. And so when the seed got there, it had no chance to take root. And so the birds would come take it away. Well, Jesus says in the spiritual sense, there's a hardness of heart about people who hear the truth. And so they don't give it a chance. And Satan, whether him directly or certainly, elements of the world that he's responsible for, just snatch it away. And so this would be like a person who hears the word for the first time, and remember it applies in that case as well as Christians. A person who hears the word for the first time and just, no, I'm not even going to listen. Maybe I don't believe there is a God, so don't care what it says. Or I believe there is a God, but not yours. Don't believe Jesus is who he says he was. I've got my own religion. Or, I believe in God, maybe even Jesus to some degree, but, as long as you live a good life, so I don't need to make any personal commitment. Well, that seed isn't given a chance to take root. Nothing happens with it. But remember I said the same thing. We can apply each of these to ourselves if we are Christians already. When a Christian hears a truth, something about them that needs to change, if they aren't open at all, like, no. One, I don't think I need it. I'm doing good. I'm doing fine. Or 2, I totally disagree with it. Not even going to listen. Whatever that is, it keeps there from being any chance. And, this can be true of Christians. I remember a person, been going to church and met me and found out, I know a little bit about the Bible. So he invited me out and he wanted to talk about something. Well, it quickly became apparent he didn't want to know what through me, the Bible had to say about anything. He wanted me to agree with what he'd said. He'd already made up his mind. He wasn't open at all. And if that's the case with us, we won't have a chance to grow and mature. We won't have a chance, if a person who's not a Christian, to become one if I'm not open to it. And so that's the first obstacle. The second obstacle is shallow commitment. This soil, verse 5, Jesus said, "Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away." He explains in verse 16, these are the ones sown on the rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. And they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. So here's a different situation. The problem here is a lack of depth. And because of that, it leads to a quick decision. 3 times Jesus uses this word immediately. And it's not in a good sense that someone hears the word and, yeah, I'm all in, I'm all for it. The quick decision, the lack of depth, means they don't really give it any consideration. They don't make a commitment. They don't pay any mind to what it's going to cost them. Jesus says, count the cost. They don't do that. And so they have no root in themselves. They try to in themselves. They're not relying on God and what He has said, what He will do to help them. And so they face this persecution that arises, notice, on account of the Word. There will be things that come into our lives when we become a Christian, and certainly as we try to live out our Christian lives. And if we're not ready for it, if we don't have a deep commitment, just what happens here, that whatever that pressure is, that persecution, the difficulty of living it out, we won't do it. Again, that could be a person who becomes a Christian. I've seen this as well. People who make this commitment, and the thing especially nowadays that comes to mind, they share it on Facebook, and every once in a while they're sharing these memes about trusting God and Bible verses and this or that. Those are good if they represent a true commitment, but not if that's all there is, because I've seen those same people then face pressures and fall away. And it can happen to Christians that we hear something and, okay, I need to be honest in the situation, but then we face the pressures of, wow, okay, here's what it's going to mean to stand up for what I believe. And we fall away as well in that specific situation. And so that's the second obstacle to truly listening and hearing. The third one is divided commitment. Verse 7 says, other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And Jesus explains, the others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. The problem here in this soil is a lack of focus. The obstacle before was pressures. This obstacle is distractions. It's not that the soil isn't deep. It's deep, but there's other things in it. And so the focus isn't on the spiritual things, the truth there. The thorns are there also, and they choke it out. And Jesus lists the kind of thorns, and what's interesting, they're not inherently bad. The cares of the world. What's that? Well, that's trying to make a living, trying to keep the house up, raise the kids. It's, getting the kids to soccer practice. Those are things that take time and can distract us from our focus on God, either initially or as we seek to grow. The deceitfulness of riches. Again, the riches aren't bad. It's the deceitfulness that is an inherent danger of riches. It's this idea that I can rely on them versus God. And that just undermines the whole foundation of this Christian faith of walk by faith, or Christian faith, which is faith, walk by faith, not by sight. It's the complete opposite. And then the desire for other things, those things aren't bad, but if I desire them to the point that they begin choking out my desire for God, my desire for Christ, that's when they're bad. And that's danger is there, and we need to be aware of it. Again, both for a person who becomes a Christian to realize there are going to be so many other things. I'm all excited now, but realize life is going to creep in, temptation, distraction. And the same thing when I, as a Christian, hear something and say, all right, I'm going to put that into practice. I often think about, I'm going to start reading the Bible, every morning. But then the cares of the world, these other things come in. I've got to be ready for those. And so here we have these three different soils, different obstacles, different problems, but at the end, they all have the same result: no fruit. Whether it happens immediately with the hard ground, very soon with the shallow soil, or eventually as the thorns choke it out, there's no growth. And so no one who is this type of soil experiences what Jesus talks about in verse 20, this bearing fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. But the same thing I said in the last video is true. All of us have the choice of which type of soil to be. All of us have the choice of whether to listen, to be open and committed or not. And that means we have the choice to be just as spiritual as we want to be. We can choose, and this is a key part of choosing. Well, this is the end of this parable, but I want to keep looking at this passage because in that middle section where the disciples talk to Jesus, he says something that raises a very serious question. Does God really want everyone to understand? Does everyone have a choice to understand? And so we'll look at that next time. For now, look at the action steps, and when you share this, be sure and tag too. Thanks.